Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to my talk. Today, I'm going to talk about Web3 native games. After I introduce myself, I'll give you 3 quick examples of what I mean by Web3 native games, and then I'll try to define them, but more importantly, give you some intuition for how to find them. For the majority of this talk, I'll be presenting the biggest problems I see in the space that are preventing Web3 native games from taking over the world. I'll try and solve one of the problems live for you, and then I'll point you to the people at the end who are solving the rest of them. Here's me. I studied game design and game history for 8 years. I did a PhD in it. I focused on mechanism design and the ways in which game makers tell stories through their rules. But in 2017, I was red-pilled to join crypto. I was given Mastering Bitcoin, and learned about crypto economics and the research there. And so I just changed teams. And I started studying blockchains and worrying about how they're secured and how they're not secured, and ended up working for an auditing firm. Audited crypto for 3.5 years, and fell in love with DeFi, and worked diligently in DeFi and joined a company called DeFi Alliance, today the Alliance, and was very excited to build a career as a crypto economic researcher until Axie became successful. And all of a sudden, games started showing up in crypto, and I wasn't allowed to do the other one. I had to do both. So today, after 2 years of doing both, which, by the way, is nothing like either one. It's like one of those weird coincidences where the sum of these 2 parts is nothing like the separate parts. I'm here to talk about what I've learned and give you the current status. So let me give you some quick mental model of how I think about Web 2, Web 2.5, and Web 3. So Minecraft, very successful Web 2 game, and the hope was that one day we would get games like Minecraft in crypto where we would get to own crypto assets. So the things you have in your game are yours, and you can trade them. And this was this promise that even if the game went away, you'd be able to keep your assets with you and play them again and again and forever. And that even if the game went bankrupt, you could rebuild servers somehow and reconnect them to your assets, and they'd be valuable again. But the problem is I didn't jive too much with this value proposition as a player, because I really wanted to not play the same game forever. I like playing new and different games, and so keeping my assets forever wasn't that stimulating an idea. And also, as someone who played a lot of Diablo 3 and then immediately churned after buying my first in-game item, I realized that selling my in-game items wasn't very interesting to me either as a player. So I started thinking about this relationship and what a Web3 game would look like, and if we could get some kind of value add from putting something fully on-chain. And the example that I found was this game called Dark Forest. Dark Forest came out in 2020. 21 gets a little bit more popular. It's about shooting people in outer space from one planet to another. It's inspired by the game Galcon, which is a classic Web 2 game where you have a bunch of stars in outer space, and you can send energy to attack other stars, and then as you have new stars, you can go attack more stars. Your opponents eventually also have their stars, and they can go and attack more stars and grow, and eventually you exponentially grow until your borders overlap, and you go to war, trying to regain territory. And the game was very interesting. It didn't actually look like this. It looked like this. But if I showed you this slide, you'd have some kind of problem understanding what was going on. It's hard to imagine if you weren't there, and to imagine why it was special, and why anyone would care to play a game this disgusting. So I'm going to build up your intuition about why I care about Web3 games and what they even are by giving some examples from normal crypto and normal Web 2 land. So the classic Web 2 concept I have for you is the US dollar. And the US dollar is very successful, goes around, lots of front ends, really fun to use. Serves lots of purposes, but it's got some problems. It's censorable, it's inflatable, it's not permissionless, and it's not even composable, right? You can't build on top of it because there's no API for the US dollar, right? Everybody's sort of faking their own APIs. And so Bitcoin comes out as this fully Web3 product that gets all these great features: censorship resistance, composability to a certain extent, permissionless. And then we get this really exciting in-between Web 2.5 product, right, which is USDC. So we don't keep all of the fun features of permissionlessness and all the fun features of being censorship resistance, but we get composability, the ability to build on top of it and to use it in smart contracts. And as long as you accept some of these trade-offs, it's actually a really powerful tool. And so there's nothing wrong with being Web 2.5 or being Web 3 or Web 2. It's just different flavors of powers. And if you think about this idea a little bit further in the sort of smart contract world, you have NASDAQ, which is this place where you can trade assets on a marketplace. And then in Web 2.5, you have this amazing product called Coinbase, where you can trade Web 3 assets on this marketplace. But once again, it's not censorship resistant. It's not permissionless. You need to do KYC. And so we build this cool new thing called Uniswap. And Uniswap is this censorship-resistant, composable, Web3 pure marketplace. And as a result, we get cool new features that we were never sure were even possible, like flash loans. In Uniswap, when you trade for something, you first get the thing. You can then do a bunch of stuff and find the money you needed for that thing in the first place after doing all that stuff. That's how flash loans work, right? And that's a magical element that comes out of putting a thing like Coinbase fully on-chain. Of course, there then are a lot of problems. It scales very badly. You can't put a central limit order book on-chain, and you have to accept they're going to have to use an AMM, and that is going to be pretty nasty user experience as well. You're going to need to know how wallets work, and you're going to need to know how to do your own security. And so very hard to get user adoption on Uniswap compared to Coinbase. And so what I'm pitching you today is this idea that the state of Web3 native games is to try and build this Uniswap of games and see how it's going to inherit the properties that Uniswap and Bitcoin exhibit. And not Web 2.5 games, which are great, like Axie, but dominate the narrative. And it's hard for anybody to see what these truly Web3 native games are doing. So here are some examples that you can play today, in case you were wondering. Dark Forest Arena is a single-player version of the game I was showing you before. You can play it not on mobile, play it on desktop. But it is a fascinating game that was really just re-released today. So you can be on the cutting edge. Just go to arena.dfdao.xyz. And you can also try out Primodium, which recently closed a round. VCs are very excited. It's growing in popularity, but it's still very new, and it's ported Factorio, a very nerdy Web 2 game to Web 3, and is making a lot of sacrifices, just like Uniswap did in bringing Coinbase to Web 3. Or you can wait for what's coming out in the future, which is Playment's game Downstream. Downstream is going to have much higher fidelity graphics, and it's got a bigger, more robust team building it with a lot of gameplay experience. These are teams that ship things like Fall Guys, sold for like $500 million, right? So real gameplay people who are more game native trying to come into the space. And I mean, if you're grumpy that I didn't include your slide here, well, I picked these games because, one, my nephew made Dark Forest DAO Arena, so I had to include him, and I invested in Primodium, so that's another disclaimer. And Playment bought me a beer 2 nights ago, so if you want to be on the slide next year, you have to do the same, one of them anyway. Okay, so now that I've sort of sold you that there's this possibility to build a fully Web3 game, it's going to sit at the intersection of 4 major problems. 1, UX UI. Same as Uniswap, it's just impossible to onboard Web 2 users to a place where you have to know a private key and sign for every transaction. Like, imagine trying to play chess and pulling out your treasure for every move. We're going to need something better than that. It's just like really garbage. So, okay, then you're going to have to worry about scale. So even at its best, Dark Forest could only have 800 players. We just clogged the entire chain of Gnosis chain when we were playing. If you think about it, just do some mental math. If a chain has 40 TPS and each player has one very strategic move to make every 30 seconds, you're going to have like something close to 2,000 players at most. That's bad. A successful game today on Steam is going to have 500,000 concurrent players. Maybe if you're ready to go a little more niche, 50,000 concurrent players. We're nowhere near that kind of scale, and so new crypto has to be invented, or new game design has to be created. And then we have no standard design patterns. No one's yet to make a successful fully on-chain game, which means that there's no like playbook to follow. There's just a new frontier of discoverability to come through with no frameworks for how to build it. And then finally, the biggest problem is we don't know what it's going to do or why it would be useful to do it at all. There's a sort of uncertainty of the value add that building a game fully on-chain will bring. And so, at least for this talk, I'm going to try and tackle the first one, the top one, because it seems the most important. If we don't know why we're building it, why bother solving these other problems in the first place? And if you were wondering, this entire slide deck is Venn diagrams. The hope is that blockchains would add new, fun gameplay loops, right? There'd be these Web3 affordances that when combined with like good game design, there'd be these special kind of games that could only show up at the intersection of like using games and blockchains. So many people thought Dark Forest had this property, like we can hide information using zero knowledge, have true fog of war that's permissionless. But after like doing quite a bit of exploration, as long as you're ready to have some trust in your game developer, there's really no new game design to build that blockchains provide. Like you're not going to get a new fun gameplay loop out of this process. So that's not why I would recommend you build games fully on-chain. Some people, like we talked about earlier with Axie, talk about quality of life benefits for players. You're going to be able to keep your assets, sell them yourself. You're going to be able to keep your assets, and if we go bankrupt, you can use them somewhere else. Another game might value your assets and include you in. But we can kind of do this with Web 2.5, and it's not clear that players actually benefit from these problems. And so once again, I don't think that there's this match where there'll be value add. But I'll pitch you on one I think really does work. And it's a new labor relationship for builders. If you think about DeFi, you have thousands of independently working Web3 developers who all get to work on the same computer, sharing same open source code, and leverage each other's code in composing their smart contracts together. This is a way where, without coordination, they can collaboratively build a new financial system. And the hope is that if people start putting their games fully trustlessly on-chain, running independently, they act as these worlds where you get to build without actually knowing who you're building with. And sure, you could kind of do that in Web 2. Like we've had open source game development for a really long time, but open source game development has actually failed to deliver anything of real significance for a really long time in Web 2. And that's because it's just really hard to coordinate running servers and sharing IP in this open source world. So by having things be fully on-chain and tracked fully on-chain and tokenized even fully on-chain, I think a new kind of labor can emerge that we see in DeFi and that we hope we can find here. And to give you like an example, in this circle I have like the design space for all possible games, right? So we haven't invented all possible games yet. But like arcade cabinets, let us design some, right? As soon as we had Pong show up in a bar, or Pac-Man show up in a bar, we had a powerful machine, lots of people able to subsidize its cost, and it was built to take quarters, to subsidize its cost over time. And this model, this business model, and this kind of technological product made for a whole set of games that we'd never made before. And then we had home consoles. The Atari 2600 comes out. And it's strictly worse than these arcade cabinets. It's such a bad computational system that doesn't even have video RAM. The way it like projects on your screen is like the code has to output as the laser is going, hoping to catch and keep in track with it. Like to play chess on the Atari 2600, they had to black out the sides of the screen just to give the computer enough time to think before the electron beam got to the other side. Like truly garbage tech, but new games were built, things we'd never seen before because it was a new business model. You were able to all of a sudden make $60 games up front that were about adventures and not focus exclusively on sucking down quarters. New business models lead to new kinds of game designs. It's like games depend on the physics of capitalism to change in order for them to evolve. And home consoles, obviously then the tech grew, We got much better at making better home consoles and eclipsed the space that arcade cabinets had provided. The same happens again with mobile phones. They're so much worse than desktop. They're so much worse than PlayStation. But we can find new gameplay loops and new monetization to create new kinds of games. It's not that those games couldn't go back to home consoles. Like any game you can make on a phone, like Flappy Birds, you can put on an Xbox, right? It's not that the medium is truly novel, it's that the financial system around it is. And so mobile phones grows, and then you get this tiny spot, blockchains, right? This hope that this new technological stack will somehow allow developers to coordinate around building something we've never seen before. But we don't know what it is, right? In the same way that when mobile phones come out, game developers haven't imagined Angry Birds yet. Angry Birds has to surprise us from this new means of production. I think, or my hope at least, is that can be sufficient enough, like value add, that we put these games fully on chain, and as a result, we can be surprised by what people build and find new games. And maybe those new games will need to go back to Web 2 to get some scaling. Maybe they'll be able to survive in Web 3 as we come up with how to scale. When it comes to scaling, there's some game companies I'd like to note. These are people who are trying to do a bunch of different things to make games go faster. Sometimes they're helping to make the games through new frameworks. Mud has a head start on most of these with a large player community. Keystone also building a game design engine focused on adding ticks to blockchains. So like we take ticks for granted in game design, like your NPC is going to do something even if you don't. But like if you don't tell the blockchain to keep computing, it doesn't keep computing. So you have to design an entire blockchain with the idea that the world will progress in time. Argus is building many things, scaling solutions, but also different frameworks for how to design games. And Dojo, which is quite present here in France and is like talks left and right, and it is quite fascinating. The idea is to build not a game that's fully on-chain, but a game where all the logic can be provably executed off-chain. So think of it like a ZK rollup for just one player's game. Like I'll play all my moves on my home computer, and then I'll compress them into one giant proof that'll actually be not that big a proof because you're using Starks and Snarks, and push that proof back to chain, and then the smart contract can see, Will did not cheat while playing this game. I can trustlessly agree with the result of this proof that this is a valid end state. And while this might seem weird, it's basically how World of Warcraft works, right? World of Warcraft is this game where everybody got to play on this massive world, but nobody played on that massive world. They played in dungeons that were completely cut off from the rest of reality in these sort of single-player instances. They'd go in with their loot, and they'd come back with more loot. And so you could imagine taking your gameplay off a main chain into some proof system and then bringing it back. And that's how even Diablo 4, which came out a month ago, operates for its sort of system. So I don't think it's too crazy to think that some of the on-chain compute would go off-chain. And so this is like how I see the state of these kinds of tools, which are helping us scale and helping us come up with more standard design patterns. And then, the remaining major problem that you might see is around UX and UI. So it's really hard to get players to Web 3, right? If you use Web 2.5, all of a sudden they can log in with Facebook. You have all the information on the servers. They can take back their assets on your chain whenever you want. But until you solve that problem, you have this huge user adoption issue. And there are many people who are trying to solve this. Here's just 3 of them, but it's way more. Alembic, which is made by the Cometh team, and Jerome DeTaichi, who actually runs this entire conference. That's his product and what he's building, which helps players just get in right away with a lot of account abstraction. And if you haven't heard of account abstraction, it's basically what's going to save us as an entire industry. And then you have Cartridge, which is on the Starkware ecosystem, and they're not only helping with UX, but with this discovery, building a Steam concept for Web3, but also a common framework for these games to allow players to play them more reasonably. And there should be a kind of like recurring mental model that you might have, which is there's an EVM layer of games, people working on like Alembic and Mud and Dark Forest, and then there's this whole other Starkware branch. And maybe you don't give Starkware much thought, but they're the other hotbed of this fully on-chain gaming activity. And so when you're thinking about which one, or which chain, or which community to join, I mean, you should join both, but those are the two vibrant ones. And to give credit where credit's due, I think the fully on-chain gaming community really started not with Ethereum, but with Gnosis Chain, or XDAI at the time, right? And so like this is this tradition I just want you to be aware of. Okay, so then Ethos, which is not on either of these, it's on Sui, right? It's sort of like wild card that I thought I'd add in here, where Ethos is building a wallet that is itself like a dashboard to apps, and they've recently just had a ton of success with a fully on-chain 2048 clone. So if you ever play 2048 on your phone, lots of little moves all the time, they blew up the entire chain by putting that on-chain. And so there might be, people in the fringes building this kind of stuff outside the EVM and the Starkware ecosystems. Okay, and so my hope is that that's where the UX UI problem is going to get handled, is in account abstraction and letting people log in once again with Facebook by having all these fancy multi-party compute things happening in the background. Okay, so that leaves us with Web3 games. Web3 games, fully on-chain, native crypto projects that very few people are building, less than maybe 500 serious builders in the space, according to my Telegram groups. But I think a lot of opportunity, and there's a lot of venture opportunity if you're unaware. So people do want to see more of this in the hopes that we can create category-defining opportunities and games in this space. Look, if you are building in this space, I want to chat with you. And if you want to try to build in this space but aren't sure how to get started, I'd also love to chat with you. So this is my Twitter handle. I left us only 2 minutes and 46 seconds for questions. That's probably not enough time to be productive. So why don't I just end it early and let people catch me outside or in my DMs. Thank you very much.